everyone, and welcome to the Curious Geographer YouTube channel in partnership with Time for Geography. Brought in today's episode is in collaboration with Time for Geography and presented in partnership with the University of Exeter. I think it is the 11th series of our kind of Curious Geographer interviews, which is very exciting. So thank you for all those who have joined live. So also, if you could just write in the comments, because I've got no one checking me, just to make sure the audio is all okay. So if someone can give me a little thumbs up, that would be fantastic. So today we are live with Dr. Matt Finn from the University of Exeter to explore the global rise of education and how this links to development and inequality around the globe. So great for kind of all levels of geography, and hopefully you can find links to kind of what you're studying as well. So I'm going to pass over to Matt, Matt, if you wouldn't mind can you start by telling us, as a geographer, why are you interested in understanding education around the world?
Yeah, so thank you. Thanks so much, Ali, for being invited to come on. And yeah, really excited to talk to you all about this today. For me, it really got started when I was trying to make sense of the different kinds of educational experiences I had growing up, different kinds of schools that I went to. I started working part-time as a teacher and also had an opportunity as part of a training scheme to visit some schools in Kazakhstan and India. And that was really interesting. It showed me that schools could be really different, and it made some of the things that I thought were just familiar to me or kind of normal to me kind of strange, and really made me question some of those things that I'd grown up with and thought were kind of normal. I also found some aspects of school really wonderful and some really challenging, and kind of later kind of worked out that I was dyslexic. And I think that kind of shaped a sense for me of wanting to understand how different people experience education, knowing that that can be really different for different people, and how that might relate to these questions about inequalities as well. Coming to university was also kind of a part of that story, because when I started geography, I realised it was so much more expansive than I'd ever realised. And I had a moment where I realised, oh, like I could look at education as a geographer, and that was a really exciting moment. So I did a PhD, so an extended research project, all about how were schools making data about pupils. This might be something that you can relate to. At the time, there was lots of stuff going on about like target grades and progress data and all of these kinds of things. And I wanted to understand, well, how are schools doing that, and how does that make a difference to pupils and teachers and how they think about the future? So I think bringing it back to kind of to you and me and all of us, I think education is something we can all relate to. We all have an experience of it, whether that's in an informal setting, so learning in a kind of family or community setting, or in like formal spaces of education. I think it's something we can all relate to. And you will, I'm sure, have picked up loads of messages where people are reinforcing all the time how fantastically important education is. We know that it might be important for people's life chances, or for states in how we think about development and economic growth. But something that is kind of a bit outside of most of our experiences of education is that kind of comparative element. Some of us have experience of moving between different places, of experiencing different kinds of education, but education varies hugely within and between countries. And it's often really contested. So economically, how do we pay for it? Kind of socially, politically, culturally, what do we teach? How do we teach it? Who are your teachers? Do you feel like they're like you or unlike you? What gets taught? How is it assessed? These are all kind of really debated things. And I'm sure we're going to come back to some of those. So I just think and became convinced that there are ways of looking at education that a geographer can bring that are just really different, that they can ask and try and answer questions that other people can't from their disciplinary backgrounds. And together with different people in education studies or sociology or a whole range of different things, geographers have something that they bring, particularly about, space and place and how that makes a difference. So yeah, that would be why I think geographers might want to be interested in education.
Fantastic. And you've said some really good things there already about particularly like scale, so how it's different within countries but also between countries. And I think sometimes we know about that local scale, but sometimes people forget, because even in like small areas in counties or boroughs, education will also be very different as well. So kind of hopefully we'll kind of draw on those ideas of place, space and kind of scale throughout the interview as well. So what are the key trends of global education?
Yeah, so I think this is such an interesting story, and really, like, if we think about it over the period, I mean, we could go back, really a long time ago, because education has been around in different forms, as long as there have been people who've wanted to communicate things and pass on knowledge, from one generation to another, or one kind of group of people to another. A lot of it's obviously been informal, but if we start to think about kind of formal education, the last 2 years, there's been incredible change. And so kind of one kind of graph or picture that we can use to illustrate that is to think about literacy rates. So literacy rates are kind of measured typically by the way in which people can read or write a simple sentence about their life, and people have been gathering data about this for a while. And education in the form of schooling has really gone global and is increasingly universal over the last kind of 200 years. So there's a graph I think we can that you can have a look at, which is there. And what you can see from that graph is really the way in which, we've gone from a period in which perhaps about 1 in 10 of the world's population might have been able to read or write a simple sentence, to ones where into the 2000s and kind of in the last kind of decade or two, we've really seen kind of significant increases. So, now that the kind of averages are around kind of 90% of the world's population would be able to read or write a simple sentence, and so are seen to be kind of literate rather than illiterate. And kind of think about that. One in nine, 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10 of the world's population would be deemed to be literate. That's incredible. And if you look about that increase in that graph, I think the thing that's even more amazing about that is think about how the world's population has grown in that period. So even in a period of growing kind of world population, we've still seen those increases, really dramatic and really important. So I think you could say, in a way, the world is as educated as it's ever been. And, in kind of 95% have basic literacy skills in most countries now. A lot of the kind of data that I'm thinking about today comes from Our World in Data. That it's updated obviously regularly. So if this is something that's really interesting to you, do go kind of check out that website. There are updates all the time. Some of the graphs that I'm using use slightly older data. There are sometimes updates, but there's often a little bit more uncertainty about some of the newer data. Another kind of graph that helps us tell this story about those big trends in education is about this rising education around the world. So what is it that underpins that increase in world literacy rate, to where now we're talking about in the kind of 80s or 90%? Well, it's as enrolments in school, so particularly kind of primary school here, has increased over time. Students are getting access to those kind of basic literacy skills. So as more people are in school, more people get access to that, and so literacy rates increase. So you can see across all kind of regions that are represented in that top graph, you can see that movement up over time. And we're talking about kind of what even in some of the areas that would be seen as kind of less economically developed, we're still talking about often kind of 6 out of 10 or 3/4, and those rates have increased even further since 2010. We'll come back a bit later to what's happening in the kind of last few years since COVID, but the general story is of a real increase in enrolment and also therefore in literacy rate. There are, though, like some differences. As geographers, we might want to ask those questions, as Ellie was mentioning about place and space and scale. And one of those kinds of graphs that you might be familiar with is one of those world maps that show you kind of coloured in those kind of, it's kind of can't even say it, choropleth maps, isn't it? The kind of coloured in ones. Now, obviously, you'll have been taught, I'm sure, that they can hide as much information as they show, but they can still give us a kind of first glance indication. And so, we can say, does literacy rate vary between different countries? The answer is yes. You would be able to describe those differences that you're seeing on that graph. There are those inequalities and differences. But I want to give a little bit of a caution. We could look at those differences in colour and think, oh yeah, this is a story I already know, kind of poor Africa, we've got kind of lower rates there. But we really want to pay attention to the colours and the way in which those colour gradations are being used on these maps. Yes, the graph does show that that there are low rates or lower rates in some sub-Saharan African countries, but many of them still have a literacy rate of 60% or above. There's been huge increases in those countries over the last decades. In many countries, in Libya, it's like 91%, Namibia 91%, Democratic Republic of Congo, 77%, like nearly 8 out of 10 people. So I think we really need to pay attention to like what do those numbers tell us, and what is the trend on those numbers, because it's a really positive story. There are still some that are lower, some where we're seeing, in South Sudan, for example, where it's kind of lower than 30%. But most people in most countries around the world are accessing education and are therefore able to kind of have some of the benefits of education too. There's when I first started looking into this and thinking about this, that was kind of where that story stopped based on the data that I was able to access at the time. But Award and Data have produced like this really amazing kind of breakdown as to how it plays out between the literacy rate of the population 65 and older and those who are 15 to 24. So you can see the top of that map, if we zoom in on the Middle East and North Africa, shows these lower rates amongst that older generation. And then if you look at the lower of those two maps, you'll see these higher rates. So you see Chad moves from 3% to 48%. Algeria, the literacy rate among young people is close to 97%, while it's 28% for the older population. And so if we just think for a moment, like, what does that actually mean? It means that, many of these young people will be able to kind of read something, read a story, read information to their grandparents who can't necessarily read to them. But in the future, think about it, those children might grow up, they might have families, they'll then be able to kind of read to their children. And that's part of that process of change that often then accelerates. So, they will be able to read to their children to them, and so on. So as of, even about 5 years ago, most young people around the world would be able to expect at least 7 years of education, that they're able to go right the way through primary school. And many of them, in most countries, are also able to access a significant number of years of secondary school education. So, yeah, I think those are some of the really big trends and some of the ones that stand out for me.
Fantastic. And a range of different graphs, and I know you said they're all from our World and Data or World and Data, but if you are an A-level student and you're interested, some of the graphs are also interactive when you click on them. So they also have the maps that change, I think sometimes from like 1950 or before. So definitely check out that website. It's great in terms of like resources that you can find and use.
Yeah, and if some of you are doing those kind of more coursework kind of style investigation-based projects, whether that's an EPQ or kind of NEA, often it allows you to do it by country as well. So if you're wanting to kind of look at particular countries and something of their story as well, you can read that from some of that data.
Brilliant. And you started to kind of talk about inequalities or differences, particularly around kind of ages. And which is really interesting, seeing like such high rates of literacy, particularly amongst the youthful kind of population. So what inequalities do exist in education around the world?
Yeah, it's such an interesting and a really important question. So I think we've seen two so far. So if you're listening, think about what ones that you would spot. For me, I think I would say that we've seen something about kind of variation between countries, and we've also seen some of that in-country variation between by age. We could also think of a range of other ones. So um, another figure that would illustrate that we might want to think about is the number of out of school children. So this is a really important group that we might want to think about. So children might be out of school for a variety of reasons. It might be something to do with their own individual characteristics. Are they being kept away from school? Are they being kind of pushed into excessive or kind of dangerous or detrimental work? Are they in a place of conflict? Is it more about the context that they're in that isn't able to support education for them? Perhaps because of inequality about provision for those with particular kinds of disabilities, or that wider kind of social economic context. Um, what you'll see from that graph, though, is the number of children out of education has been kind of decreasing. There was a big kind of push on this internationally and nationally, and that number has been steadily coming down. Your graph kind of goes to about 2014. It's kind of carried on around that kind of 250 million level. So obviously, it's great to see that it's come down. It's really troubling to see that it's plateaued. And there's some evidence emerging now that that number might be starting to increase again, which would be kind of really unhappy because of that progress that we've seen over time. But we're starting to think that COVID and also, and particularly the cost of living pressures that people are talking about in the news here, but are really being felt right across the globe to different extents, but is still a significant factor, is pushing increasingly young people into work. So the International Labour Organization have produced a report just recently, which talks about that. You can go onto their website and find it if that's something you want to look into more. But it's suggesting that progress that we've seen about more people being able to enrol and remain in education has been staying. The other thing that we probably want to pay attention to is the way in which enrolling in education is not the same thing as attendance at education. So we've seen, those real increases in enrollment, but like, how many days are you able to go to school? Like, what are the things that enable that? What are the things that make that more difficult? And I think another form of inequality that you start to pick up when you think about those international agendas. So, I'm sure you'll have heard of the Millennium Development Goals. Millennium Development Goal 2 was universal primary education. And that was really about saying, how do we make sure that everyone has access to primary education, no matter what the country is? And there's been, as we've seen, there's been huge progress on that. Sustainable development goals then come along, and obviously, these are all kind of quite contested in different ways, but they indicate something about that bigger picture scale of kind of internationally defined priorities. The sustainable development goals are not meant to be just focused on so-called kind of poorer countries or developing countries, but are meant to be able to apply to all countries. So Sustainable Development Goal 4 is quality education. So the idea is people are able to access education. Hopefully people can stay in education. But what's the quality? How do we make sure that people are able to learn? And there are big kind of questions about quality. Yes, most schools have trained teachers in them, but that's still different, based on kind of class sizes. Is the instruction in your language, or are you needing to learn school in another language than the language that you speak at home? Those things around multi-generational knowledge that we were picking up around those literacy rates, these are also things that can make a real difference. So I think, there are a range of issues that both kind of cause and help us describe some of those inequalities that we're seeing. There might be other ones that you can think of as well, but those are some of the ones that stand out for me.
I wondered if you knew much, and I know things. I think sometimes students maybe don't quite realise, but you go into loads and loads of detail when you're a researcher at university. So don't worry if this isn't like your speciality. But one thing we teach about at school, I teach at a girls' school, is also gender inequality in education. And I wondered if you had any comments or any findings on how education kind of varies between genders around the world.
Yeah, I mean, so this is fascinating, and I'm going to say that you get different stories when you look at different scales. So this is a really important one where that geography idea about scale makes a big difference. So if you go back even kind of 10 to 15 years ago, you would have seen really quite noticeable differences between, for example, those who were out of school, in comparing, the graph that you saw just earlier, boys to girls. Those differences, though, have been really decreasing. And so I would say broadly, at that really big scale, things around access to education is now much more equal. I think that's not always the story that we pick up, because we're perhaps really alert to, for example, stories about what's happening in Afghanistan, which have been widely criticised by a variety of countries, including kind of countries right across the Middle East and North Africa, and criticised by Arab and Islamic majority countries. But we kind of might be particularly aware of the inequalities around gender that we see in Afghanistan, and think that tells us something, that tells us the big story about what's going on around gender. And broadly, the evidence that I've seen suggests that's not the case. Things are much more gender equal in terms of access than they were. In some contexts, more girls than women would go to university than achieve higher, and more girls might go to university than boys, kind of women to men. So I think there will be, but it does also vary by country. It might also vary by region. So it's one of those ones where depending on the kind of scale and place you look at, you might tell a different story about that. So it's not to say, oh yes, things are all equal by any means. There are still a range of ways in which the experience or outcomes for girls and women might be worse. And we should be definitely kind of paying attention to those and trying to address those, in terms of like everyday sexism, the kind of things that might kind of hinder access. But at that big picture scale, that's not typically the pattern that we see now. But again, like that's why I've tried to kind of say there can be a difference between access and then experience in education. Although if you look in some places, the outcomes are better. So I don't know, I'm giving you kind of quite a kind of complicated story, because it's harder to kind of tell at the kind of really big scale some of those stories, because scale makes such a big difference to it. So it's a great thing that geographers can research and look into and explore, but some of it is kind of slightly runs counter to what we've seen that would have been a much bigger set of differences, even 5 to 10 years ago in some of that global data.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think that you're right. Maybe things that we see on TV can sometimes give a different picture. So I just was thinking about the quiz in Factfulness, which is a great book if anybody is interested in it. And we just do the quiz with our one of our year groups at school. And one of the questions I just found, just to confirm, and it was like, worldwide, 30-year-old men have spent 10 years in school on average. How many years have women of the same age spent in school? And the options are 3 years, 6 years, or 9 years. And the correct answer is 9 years. Kind of thinking about that kind of global scale, as you said, kind of becoming more even. But often people assume from kind of images we see on TV that figure must be quite low as well. So it's quite interesting around that. And then what you were saying again about enrolling and experiences, then there are lots of I think like maybe like more challenges that particularly in like lower income countries in terms of like access to like clean sanitation, so kind of girls being on like their period, or like dangerous journeys as well. So kind of like what does that actually look like in reality in terms of who is actually able to access that learning, whether you're enrolled in school or.
Yeah. And there's some really great research about exactly those things, because I think, and that's exactly why I think, again, geographers paying attention to scale, but also that I guess the kind of phrase that we might use is that more ethnographic research. So kind of being in a place, kind of seeing what's happening, talking with people. Some of those things are reflected in data that's gathered, but the our world in data, as much as I think it tells us some really interesting and important things about the world, it has a slight tendency, or I don't know, you could say bias, but to certain kinds of data that is kind of measured and collected, and that might not always address or pick up some of those more experiential elements of it, because sometimes that data isn't gathered, or the data that needs to be gathered is in a different form. So I think that's why, picking up, some of you might come across these distinctions between quantitative and qualitative data. And I think it's just why, kind of geographers and researchers in general want to pay attention to all of those different kinds of sources and stories, and stories through numbers, or stories through kind of the interviews or other things that people are doing to kind of make sense and understand what's happening in the world.
And I forgot to say that if anybody does have a question for Matt, please do write it in the comments, and I will either weave them through or put them at the end. Or if you're Matt does a lot of work with kind of students coming up to university as well, so if you have any questions about that, we can ask those too. So let's talk about the benefits. So what are the benefits of this kind of rise in education around the world? We've looked at an increase in literacy rates around the world. What are the positives of this?
Yeah, I mean, so people generally say, and I think they're right, that often we talk about education as having kind of individual benefits and collective benefits. The other way that of talking about it that is not quite the same is to say kind of social benefits and private benefits and social benefits. So what does that mean? Typically, the more education that we get, that's associated with kind of better life outcomes, whether that is in terms of earnings or job satisfaction or pro-social behaviours or health outcomes. What gets quite complicated and knotty about that, so kind of typically in school, the story that we tell is that education is really important, more education is better, and it has those individual benefits, and it also has benefits for nation states. So nation states are typically really interested in education because of the way in which it can increase, what gets called human capital. So, you're trying to kind of build up the knowledge and skills of the population, and that's going to lead to increased productivity, to economic growth, and to kind of development big picture. It does, when the people who get really nerdy about this stuff tell us that obviously correlation, so more education, better outcome, correlating with better outcomes, it's kind of difficult to say, is it that the education itself is the thing that is resulting in these better outcomes? Or is it, as we might imagine, that actually sometimes the context that allows people to go and stay in education for longer might tell us other things about their economic circumstances or the economic context of that state or that society. So there's a bit of a debate in some of the writing about this. People broadly agree that there is a causal relationship which seems to kind of make sense with what we might assume, that as you get more education, it does result in these kind of benefits for people. Another one that people will often say is, we see that there's an association between improved education for girls and women, and improved health for women, and also then typically things like reductions in family size. So the kind of story there goes, that it's about kind of female empowerment and agency, also about kind of better kind of knowledge or skills that improve the health outcomes for children where women are having children. So reduction in child mortality would be one of those things. And again, there's kind of good evidence for that. The correlations are there. Again, it's still slightly difficult to unpick kind of what's the cause. Is it that education is resulting in that? Or again, as societies, as the kind of structures of society kind of change and improve and economic opportunities increase, that actually it's more possible for girls and women to kind of go into education and stay in it longer, and then they're also therefore making these kind of choices that result in kind of broadly kind of smaller family sizes. So broadly, everyone agrees that there are benefits, but quite exactly, is it the education that's causing it, or is it the kind of other things that mean that there's more education? That's kind of a bit trickier.
So many links to kind of how geographers interpret data, like correlation, causation, and we've looked at different scales. So yeah, really kind of looking at it through the lens of a geographer, which is fantastic. So is education always a good thing? Is it always a force for good?
Yeah, so I think I'm really glad that we're talking about this, because I think this is one of the things that can surprise people more. Obviously, if you are watching this and are kind of going to a school at the moment, it's kind of in a school's interests to kind of like to tell you a story, and a story that's probably right, about why education's really important, why it's really good. People are persuaded by it, and that's a really positive thing. But it can make it harder to kind of be thoughtful or ask questions about, well, when might education not be a force for good, or what different arguments have people made in the past and now about why education can be more of a challenge. So some of you will have come across uh, different ideologies, political ideologies. So, for example, a Marxist might make an argument that kind of education structures and systems are broadly designed kind of in the image of capitalism. They're designed to kind of produce labour, so to produce kind of workers, and to kind of slot people into different roles and jobs in society. So for some people, education will be a more negative experience where they might learn less, and that might then kind of justify them having a certain kind of role in society that might result in kind of lower wages. Some people have certain kind of knowledge and skills and family kind of knowledge and context that might mean they do better in education, and then kind of get slotted in certain kinds of jobs. So that challenges some of these ideas around meritocracy. So this idea that it's due to some kind of innate being better at things, that kind of the merit that means that people are put into these kind of different slots. And it's as much about kind of the low skill as the high skill. And so people have said, okay, look, there are these kind of like things. People have also said, oh, look, as education has increased, one of the knock-on effects seems to be that education, the kind of value of education might be seen to decrease a bit over time. So, maybe in the past, if people had a degree, that really set them apart, and people used it as a kind of filtering mechanism for could they get into certain kind of jobs or not. Like, we should be aware that in a significant part that's still the case, and you might think that's a positive or negative thing, but there can be this idea, oh, maybe you need a master's now, or maybe you need this, or maybe you need that, to kind of distinguish yourself. And it's this sense of a kind of competitive context in which you're competing against other people, and maybe education is one of those things that's used to differentiate people. Another kind of argument that people come across is the idea that because we come into education with different experiences, backgrounds, and kind of cultures, knowledges, some of which might be seen to kind of fit the school context, the kind of teachers' backgrounds, kind of more or less. There's a range of research that argues that inequalities shape our access to education and also our experiences of education. So some people argue that rather than education reducing inequality, it actually increases it, which can be kind of like quite a surprising thing to think of at first. But the argument would go something a bit like this. If you're coming into school and you have some of these disadvantaged experiences, maybe it's harder for you to make the same progress as your peers who have kind of more advantages in some ways. And so actually, rather than reducing that inequality over time, that gap might widen. And obviously, like teachers and schools and think tanks and charities do so much to try and say, how do we reduce that gap? How do we think about social mobility? But it can be the case, and some of this data would support that gap can increase. Some students are more likely to not finish their schooling than others. There can be regional and quite local differences. Which schools are really struggling to recruit teachers? Which schools might have a higher turnover of teachers? There can be all sorts of those kind of differences. I'll just mention one other one, which can be the way in which the language of education can make a really big difference. So, both in the UK and in other countries, there can often be dominant languages that are used. So, is that you're educated in English or in Welsh or in, name a language. And sometimes within a country, students might have multiple schools near them that are taught in different languages. But it might mean that you're coming to school in a context where you're being asked to do your education in a language that is not the language that you speak at home. That can result in real benefits for some communities in terms of skills in multiple languages and ability to kind of move between different contexts, but can also mean that some people feel excluded. So in some contexts, your language might be banned in school, or you're told off, or you face different kinds of punishment if you're found speaking that language. You might be made to feel excluded or lesser than because of your cultural background, context, life, group, ethnicity, circumstance, and so on. So there can be ways in which education, again, kind of increases inequality or actually results in really significant kinds of exclusion. So exclusion while you're included, where that then, again, has these implications for kind of life chances. So there are others as well, but those would be kind of some significant ones that kind of stand out. Another one that people might come across through other things is the way in which education sometimes gets linked with kind of ideas around indoctrination or kind of promoting certain kind of national political or religious ideologies that others might then kind of critique and be concerned about the way in which the state or particular groups can monopolize education for certain kind of ends. So education does stuff, it's powerful, but that power, people can experience it really differently.
Brilliant, and I really like the complexities that you've just gone into there. So it's a very complicated picture, with many things to kind of think about, and that actually there's particularly about who might be excluded even when you're included as well. I do have one short, quick question to add in. I know we are close to our kind of time soon, and then we'll be asking you how you got to where you are. But I just wondered, I don't think we've touched on this too much. Was how do you think technology or the internet has shaped education?
Yeah, I mean, really interesting and a huge question. So I'll try and think of how to give a quick answer. I think no one would disagree that it's had a really big impact. Some people used to say, you go into a kind of an operating theatre in a hospital, and you take someone from 100 years ago, you put them in there now, they wouldn't have a clue what to do. But they say, take a teacher from 100 years ago, put them in a classroom, and they'd still get on just fine. And I was kind of going there, sitting, saying, no, that's not true. For a whole bunch of reasons, that's not true. But it played into a kind of myth that education hasn't really changed over time, and it really has in a number of ways. So big thing, education is responding to the fact that students and adults can access knowledge. Knowledge is now, the word we might use is ubiquitous. You can kind of get it anywhere. It can be easy to access. Challenge that comes with that is, how do we make sense of that knowledge? How do we, is it knowledge? Is it kind of like fake news? Is it it requires a lot of knowledge and skill to try and make sense of that kind of volume and the kind of quality of that kind of information. But theoretically, you could say, hey, could we just learn everything from the internet or be super personalized? But there are some real kind of challenges about that, about the relationship. Education I think it's like fundamentally about kind of the relationships between the people kind of often in the room or kind of digitally, virtually. Some educational technologies and internet things are enabling people to access education who couldn't. So particularly in rural or remote areas, that's really opening up some exciting things all over the place, particularly for people who couldn't. Um, uh, there are also huge companies that are massively interested in how they can kind of sell their services, platforms to schools. Some people are writing about how we should think about school not as like a kind of building that people go into, but a kind of digital platform where kind of data is kind of sucked in from students, where schools are kind of paying for access. You can hear that this is like it's a kind of critique of the role of those companies, but nevertheless, other people would then say those companies have done massive to improve like outcomes. So debates, but yeah, I'm going to stop there because there's so much more you can say, but I'll stop.
No, that's fantastic. Yeah, and as I said, I probably could ask loads of questions on that, or like could be a branch into a whole new different interview as well. So this question I feel actually really links in terms of the topic of education. But we ask all guests, how do you get to your career, and do you have any advice for students taking their next steps?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to be kind of quite honest. Like I've told you a bit about kind of my story. Part of the story that I haven't said yet was that I went to university to do a different degree subject. The first year didn't go very well. I got quite stuck. I didn't know what I was doing, and ended up having to leave that course. I kind of failed kind of one of those exams and the reset of it. And that was a really difficult experience, particularly if you've not encountered that kind of form of educational failure before. I'm sure that's also shaped my experience and interest in like how do we understand success and failure and those kind of things. But I decided I wanted to go back to kind of university. I wanted to study geography. I kept kind of being curious in the first course that I did about what does this play out for people? And that wasn't a great question for the subject that I was asking, but was a really good geography question. So I kind of had got not quite found the right route through initially, although I'm massively grateful for that period, both of study and then working. I took 3 gap years. I worked for 3 years. So I had a kind of interesting route back. So my goal then was to like start and try and finish a degree. And I just love geography. I'd never thought about going on and doing more study. But some people kind of asked me if I'd thought about that, to which the answer, of course, was like, no. My goal was to like just like to start and finish one. But I got really excited about what you could do in and through geography. I found that really inspiring. I applied to do more study and was able to receive bursary funding to do that. But I think otherwise I can't imagine how I would have done that. And kind of from that decided, yeah, I really want to be in education, both learning about it and teaching, and didn't know if I would do that in schools, but in the end kind of have ended up doing it in universities. So that's kind of a bit about how I've got to where I've got to. In terms of like advice, I don't know. I think there are a few kind of really brief things. So, like find or make space for you. So, I'm really conscious that you might be kind of watching this or listening to this, and you might feel that there are people who you see teaching geography who are like you, or you might be looking and thinking, look, I don't think there's like anyone like me, but geography changes. It's always changing, and it becomes what it is based on who's there. So like find the spaces that you feel like you've got something to contribute to, or the spaces that you feel are like open, or if you don't see them, make them. Geography isn't just this kind of static thing that just is there and is just in a kind of textbook that is never changing. It changes based on who's there, and it's part of all of our work to try and make sure that anyone can feel included and welcome, and that there's space for them. But find or make space for you, as well as the fact that geography needs to kind of be making sure as a discipline, as a subject, we're not those of us who are involved in it already and not kind of making that harder for people. And then like I don't know, I'm going to say something that's like it's kind of it's in Ellie's title, like be curious, like like just be on the lookout. What are those things that interest you? Are there ways of kind of linking that to geography in ways that you've maybe never even like thought of before? Geography is so expansive, and it can really take you so many places. Feed your curiosity. So what are those things, that you can watch, listen to? There are these amazing videos, there's podcasts, there's things you could read, there are like things you could go see, that can feed that curiosity that you've had. And then like join the dots. So like join the dots between those things that are feeding your curiosity, even if it doesn't sound like it's geography. Like what are those links that are kind of there? They're always there, or often always there. So like, find or make space for you, be curious, feed your curiosity, and then kind of join the dots and kind of play the game of thinking, oh, how does this connect? How is this geography? And then see what connections you find or make.
Fantastic. I always love the last kind of part, the last tips, because I always think it's so great just to hear some kind of inspiration about some ideas, kind of what different kind of paths, and just generally like life advice for our young people going forwards. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for being a guest on the Curious Geographer with Time for Geography. And it's been an absolute pleasure. It's been really interesting. And thank you everybody for joining. We've had quite a few of you join live, which is absolutely brilliant for the start of term. So fantastic, for having you join and taking your time to be part of this live interview. So just a huge thank you from everybody here, Matt, for joining live.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to you.
Brilliant. And then just let everybody know, just to kind of sign off, if you haven't already checked out the Time for Geography website, this is where all the live interviews are kind of held, and also our shorter videos as well. And there's been loads of uploads over just before the autumn term, so the end of the summer. One's on kind of fast fashion, one's on the Southern Ocean, so definitely check that out. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks. There'll be an email sent out for Time for Geography on our next live interview. So hope you all have a wonderful start to your term, and that you all enjoy the rest of your week.